So you're looking for a high quality 50mm lens to put on the front of your camera so you can get amazing cinematic images out of it. But unfortunately, you don't have G Master money. And in fact, I don't have G Master money either. I actually got this lens on a massive discount and I've been using it ever since. But today's video is not about the 50mm G Master lens by Sony. We're actually going to be talking about the TT Artisans 50mm f1.4. Now this lens has a whopping price tag of $225, and we're going to pair it with my Sony FX6 to find out if cheap lenses work on expensive cameras. We'll get there. Now to start things off, this lens is actually incredibly tiny. It's only about a few inches long. It's actually really small and only weighs about a pound. And compared to my 50mm G Master lens, it's much bigger and it's much heavier, which means that this might be you and this is the lens I told you not to worry about. Body shaming aside, there are a couple of things that you want to know about while using this lens. First of all, it's not going to have autofocus, so if that's what you're looking for, you might not get it out of this TT Artisans 50mm lens. However, it does feel like it has a longer focus throw. It's not really listed what the degrees are for it, but I found it smooth and you actually get a pretty decent range in comparison to a autofocus lens. Now with a smaller lens, you're going to have a smaller filter thread as well. And the TT Artisans 50mm is only 45mm, which means for the most part, if you need filters, you're probably going to need to use some step-up rings. You're also going to be dealing with a manual aperture at 1.4 as well, which is great because it's going to be good in low light at that 1.4 aperture. And to be honest, the 50mm f1.2 might have a slightly lower f-stop, however, I don't notice a giant difference between f1.2 and f1.4. It's still going to be great in low light and you're still going to get that blurry background that a lot of people like in their images. Now the sharpness and the color jump out at me the most in terms of the image quality from this lens. Although it's only $200, a lot of the colors look really good. I actually graded a lot of these clips using my LUTs and it looked just as good from a color perspective as anything else. And in terms of the sharpness, it's not necessarily a G Master type of sharp, which is fine because it's 1/10 of the price, but it does look incredibly good. Now it does have some nice roll off, or at the very least, it's not a super contrasty lens when I was getting test footage, which is great because it does have a vintage look, which a lot of people like, and for only $200, it looks pretty good from an image quality perspective. Now bribing my girlfriend with snacks is the only way we're gonna get through this, but comparing the TT Artisans to the 50mm G Master, they actually don't look super far apart from each other. Now the G Master lens is obviously going to be known for its sharpness, its contrast, and it has a little bit more punch in the colors. It has a little bit more saturation. However, the TT Artisans lens does have a little bit more of a muted look, but it also has a really nice highlight roll off. So when I do compare this to the 50mm G Master with a light source just coming in from the window, the highlight roll off on the forehead actually, I think, looks a little bit better than a photography lens, which you find a lot in vintage lenses. Typically because they don't have those coatings for high contrast situations, it has a little bit nicer of a roll off, a nicer fall off from a highlight down to the rest of your image. Now, when working with cheaper lenses, you might run into something called chromatic aberration, which happens when you have high contrast parts of your image. There might be some purple or some green outlining around different parts of your frame, and unfortunately, the cheaper lenses, the more you might see this happen. Now, for me personally, when I was getting test footage, I was in a high contrast area. There was a lot of darker parts of my image, but there was also a lot of bright lights as well. And although there was chromatic aberration in each one of these scenarios, I didn't find it to be entirely off-putting. Now, some lenses are actually worse for this than others, but the TT Artisans 50mm, although it has that characteristic, it's not the worst thing in the world. And if anything, if I don't look for it, I probably don't see it. Now there is one thing that I can't unsee, and that's going to be the flaring that comes out of this lens. Now different lenses are going to react to light sources in different ways, from not flaring at all to having an anamorphic flare. But on the TT Artisans 50mm, what ends up happening is that I have this washed out flare that stays on my frame, and it's really hard to go away, and sometimes it becomes a little bit off-putting. When I was getting test footage in this gym, when I was getting closer to the light, there was a big washed out flare that was at the top or different parts of my image. Even when I stopped down to 1.4 or even down to f16, that flare wasn't going anywhere. Now for some people, you might chalk that up to the character of the lens, and some people actually might like that imperfection. But for professional work or for corporate work, it might not be something that you're necessarily after. Now, characters of different lenses are going to have different attributes and they're going to have different imperfections. So when you're working with cheaper lenses, you have to be aware of that. But all in all, it's something that might work for your story, but in some cases it might not at all. Now, those are some of the characteristics and features of this lens that you have to be aware of. And it might sound a little bit negative, however, you are going to get what you pay for. And there's a couple of different reasons why people opt for cheaper lenses instead of going for the more expensive guys. Number one is obviously going to be budget constraints. If you're somebody that's a beginner, or if you're someone that doesn't have a ton of money, then getting a cheaper lens, even though there's other fully featured lenses that cost 2 or 5 or even sometimes 10 times as much, getting something a little bit cheaper and learning the ins and outs of that lens might be more beneficial to you. I know that when I was starting out, I didn't have $1,000 for a lens. I didn't have $2,000 for a lens. I might have had a couple $100 for my part-time job, and getting a lens that was going to work with me that I can grow into was something that was important. The second thing is going to be convenience. Like, this lens is actually incredibly small. It fits in the palm of my hand and it doesn't draw a lot of attention to myself. And even though I'm using my Sony FX6 for the testing camera for this lens, I could use a smaller camera with this and be a little bit more inconspicuous, which means that if I'm shooting out in public, it's less of a chance that I'm going to get robbed. And lastly, and a reason why a lot of people, even veteran cinematographers, use cheaper lenses or use more vintage glass is going to be that lens character. Now, I get it. You're using a G Master lens or using something from your favorite YouTuber in terms of the native glass, like a 50mm GM or something else from another company. It looks really good. It's sharp, it's pristine, and it looks absolutely perfect. However, if you have a story that's imperfect or you want an image that has a certain level of character to it, you might want to look at something like the TT Artisans f1.4 because it has a lot of that. Its highlights are a little bit on the bloomier side. Its colors aren't incredibly contrasty. It does have some lens imperfections, and if you have a story that leans into that type of look, then that actually might be a more value to you, even though it's going to have a fraction of that price tag, which means that sometimes cheaper lenses are actually going to be better than the more expensive guys. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or at the very least you learned something about using cheaper lenses on more expensive cameras. And if you want to see another video on this channel, well, I'll probably leave it somewhere on the screen like I always do. And that being said, see you in the next one. Peace.